Our two speakers will give an overview of gender and liturgy in the wider Anglican communion to provide the context for discussion, and then Dr. Merete Thomassen will respond, drawing upon her experience of liturgical revision in the Lutheran Church in Norway. So our first speaker is Dr. Bridget Nichols, who is a lecturer in Anglicanism and liturgy in the Church of Ireland Theological Institute, Dublin. Our respondent is Professor Merete Thomassen, an Associate Professor of Liturgical Studies in the University of Oslo, and also an ordained minister in the Church of Norway. So without any more ado, could I invite Dr. Nichols to speak, please?
First of all, thank you very much to Dr. Jasper for such a generous introduction. And it falls to me now to tell you something about developments in the Anglican Communion. The Anglican Communion has been talking about language and gender and their volatile association in liturgy for at least 40 years. That's more an observation than an accusation, although impatience and frustration at the uneven pace and perceived conservatism of efforts at liturgical revision are entirely legitimate. The discussion is a complex one for a number of reasons. First of all, its own subject matter has shifted from the inclusive language debates of the 1970s and 1980s, whose main interests are summed up in the title of a Church of England study called Making Women Visible. Secondly, calls for inclusion now extend well beyond the desire of women to hear themselves recognized, acknowledged, and represented in the language of liturgy. Other distinctive constituencies seek the same kind of recognition, thus widening the focus on justice. Thirdly, and in the light of the first 2 points, solutions cannot straightforwardly be found by adding more feminine imagery. And this leads to a fourth concern, one which has very properly come to the center of the liturgy language gender conversation, and that's the language we use to address and refer to God in worship. Our God language is prior to all the other interests just mentioned, not least because it determines the ways in which human beings are or are not able to see themselves in relation to God. The tensions in the ways in which these complexities are addressed were identified by the Catholic theologian Catherine Mary Lacuna in 1989. Asking the question whether liturgy could ever again be a source for theology, she suggested that people do not normally feel so deeply over matters of formal doctrinal statement unless those matters are felt to bear upon the practice of their piety. She applied this to the still current controversy over the fatherhood of God, noting that the disagreement over the fatherhood of God is a pastoral problem, which is experienced in all its intractability at the liturgical level. Theologies like the death of God and theology of play were passing fads largely, she argued, because they had little to do with the life of worship and prayer. Feminist theologies, on the other hand, have perdured, not just because of the proliferation of theories, but because the critique of feminism has come to bear directly on worship and vice versa. 30 years later, it is not only feminist critique that informs our responses and sensitivities. The imperatives of inclusion now encompass sexual orientation, gender identity, and the complexity implied by LGBTQI+, disability, and ethnic minority status. What some branches of feminist critique valuably continue to campaign for is the justice that extends not only to women, but to all who have experienced disregard and exclusion. If these people have persisted in a practice of Christian worship, it has inevitably been with ears attuned to slights and omissions and negligence. All of these things touch our piety. The way they are being addressed across the 41 member churches of the Anglican Communion is not homogeneous. These churches encompass enormous cultural diversity. Not all are English-speaking. Some have moved in step with changing social attitudes, while others have resisted the secular signs of inclusion. And member churches in the developing world often have neither the financial nor the theological resources to engage in projects of liturgical revision. Where resources are available, it is usually theologians and liturgists who are put to work on solutions, and attention to the piety of worshippers is marginal. This paper thus has a twofold purpose: to give a brief survey of some recent and current developments addressing gender and liturgy in the communion, and to draw out some of those suggestions that bodies charged with liturgical revision in the future might consider. I will do no more than mention some of the ongoing projects before moving to two whose approaches seem particularly innovative: the Anglican churches of New Zealand and Brazil. The decision that any revising body has to make is between serial work on individual rights, which is what the Scottish Episcopal Church has done so far, or a comprehensive revision of an entire prayer book. Between 1979 and 2015, there have been completely new modern language Anglican prayer books in the United States, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, the Church of England, the Church of Ireland, and Brazil. During the same period, other member churches have produced supplements to existing books and revisions of individual rights. This has been the practice in Canada and Scotland. At this stage, books that were more or less contemporary and registered 30 years ago are beginning to look dated. And in some places, supplementary material has been produced to address the need for change. And the Episcopal Church in the United States' collection of material using what it calls expansive language is a good example. In others, a completely new book is being produced over a period of time. This is the case in Southern Africa, where the prayer book is being rebuilt from a different set of principles, emphasizing the Church's Southern Hemisphere location, its 14 language groups and ethnic and cultural mix, and its wish to foster vernacular liturgical composition. Meanwhile, Anglican churches in Japan, Hong Kong, and Korea are still struggling to correct the poor translations of their existing books, all derived from English language versions of the Book of Common Prayer. I move now to New Zealand. And the Anglican Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand and Polynesia published a new prayer book in 1989, which has deservedly enjoyed great admiration. Its achievements in cultural inclusiveness, its efforts to speak of its own geographical setting rather than enshrining the Northern Hemisphere geography of the BCP, and its expansion into the range and literary styles, especially in the style of the Collect, have all acted as models for revision projects in other parts of the Anglican Communion. Itself the fruit of steady work on the part of the Church's Liturgical Commission over a number of years, the 1989 book did not come as a shock. The updated version, which just appeared last year, 2020, built on what was already familiar and already carefully evaluated over 30 years of use. Inclusive language, of course, continues to be a prominent aspiration and gives rise to a conscious reflection on the ways in which it is possible to address God. Now, this may not be a new question, but it is one which has not been asked enough during a period when the verbal and symbolic inclusion of all members of the worshiping assembly has been the central concern. The approach to composition has consistently been not to add feminine characteristics to God, but to emphasize ungendered attributes, roles, and functions. So there is much emphasis on God as creator, including a full service of thanksgiving for creation. Collect addressed to Christ and to the Spirit were present in the 1989 book and continue in the new publication. The influence of Janet Morley's work on the composition of the 1989 Collect has stood the test of time. Since 1989, the Maori language has been recognized as an official language, and the new book recognizes this with parallel texts, especially for parts of the Eucharistic, baptismal, and funeral rites. The introduction of a translation of the Eucharistic rite in the Tongan language has posed rather more difficulty, and this is because the convention in Tongan has been to use the language reserved for royalty for persons of the Trinity. The rather hierarchical aspect of this practice has made the original translation unwelcome to clergy and to worshippers. But there has recently been consultation with the Tongan royal family, and this has led to an acceptable middle way. The Trinity is now addressed in the register used for members of the nobility. In common with churches all over the world, the Anglican community in New Zealand has had to reckon with issues of justice and mutuality. The Liturgical Commission points to the tendency to ascribe to God attitudes and prejudices which are ours alone, and then to enshrine them in our liturgies. At the same time, it is aware that words cannot be a total solution to discrimination and exclusion. Music, silence, and other means of nurturing the prayerful imagination have a powerful part to play. Potential users of the book are encouraged to attend to the particularities of place, culture, and identity as the people of God in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's always a risk to offer examples from a very rich collection that offers a template for the whole programme of public worship. But two collects will give an idea of some of its drafting. The collect for the Feast of the Epiphany extends the feast's theological concentration on Jesus as the light of the world to practical concern for that world as part of the whole business of the Christian life. The key figures in the story of the visit of the Magi are therefore subtly caught up in its weave: the family of Jesus, the Magi themselves, and King Herod. In the prayer, they are used to allude to transformations of fallible institutions and structures. Jesus, light of the world, let your bright star stand over the place where the poor have to live. Lead our sages to wisdom and our rulers to reverence. Hear this prayer for your love's sake. For Ash Wednesday, the well-known Almighty and everlasting God, who hatest nothing that thou hast made, becomes a more mysterious presence in the spiritual deserts of all kinds that may open up during the season of Lent. This transcends gender altogether by asserting presence rather than characteristics. It is interesting in that light that the tempter remains male. God of the desert, as we follow Jesus into the unknown, may we recognize the tempter when he comes. Let it be your bread we eat, your world we serve, and you alone we worship. This we ask through Jesus Christ, our Redeemer. From New Zealand, we now move to Brazil. In 2015, the Episcopal Anglican Church of Brazil produced what is currently the most recent prayer book to have emerged from an Anglican Communion member church. Luiz Coelho, a liturgist who was closely involved in the revision, sums up the achievement. It is a full gender-neutral worship book, with expansive language to address the divine and a considerable number of liturgies that deal with local customs. It also features prayers that address themes such as gender equality, environmental preservation, and social justice for minorities. Coelho places the linguistic principles of the Brazilian prayer book firmly in the context of its societal and global commitments. In the first place, the book was made accessible to a much wider body of worshippers by the decision to use uncomplicated grammatical forms. This recognized that many Brazilian Anglicans struggled with the archaic 19th century Portuguese of their previous prayer book. The Church's website testifies to ongoing work towards gender justice and the suppression of violence towards women. The safety of LGBTQI+ people is a subject for regular discussion. Environmental destruction figures largely, as might be expected as the struggle goes on to save the Amazon rainforest from exploitation. Brazil was the third member church of the Communion to recognize and provide for same-sex marriage. And like the Scottish Episcopal Church and the Episcopal Church in the United States, the 2015 marriage rite does not use gender-specific language for the marriage partners. A new approach to language for the divine can be seen in changes to the collects for Christmas, the Sundays after Christmas, and the Epiphany. Here, God is addressed as maternal Father, source of life, loving God, marvelous God, wonderful God, light of the nations. Some new compositions take up urgent social issues. A prayer for courage to struggle on behalf of minorities begins, triumphant justice who blows upon all the nations. There is a prayer for women who suffer violence, abuse, and harassment, beginning, God of maternal love, breath of justice. A prayer for the preservation of the natural world begins like this: breath of life, who has conceived in your womb all created order. The authors of these prayers have chosen to name their concerns directly, which may be disconcerting for those who consciously or unconsciously expect balanced cadences in the style of BCP collects and turns of phrase which take a general or even elusive approach. Perhaps the brilliant Brazilian choices alert us to the task of calling things what they are, even in prayer. And now a few remarks on trends and observations arising out of these more specific examples. This has necessarily been a rather sketchy survey of liturgical work in progress across the Anglican Communion, and it shows the difficulties of drawing communion-wide conclusions. The two member churches I've discussed are in some ways atypical in their departures from a more recognisably Anglican register of prayer, which remains conventional, even when many gender markers have been removed. It is possible, though, to point to some emerging trends. In the first place, revision is increasingly contextually driven. We see this in various forms, from respectful relationships with Indigenous people to a more realistic matching of local seasonal conditions to the liturgical year. There is no more bleak midwinter in Southern Hemisphere Christmases. We see it also in addresses to climate justice, to gender justice, to educational access. The growing urgency of the climate crisis has seen much more attention being given to creation in new liturgical composition across the communion. As far as the use or not of gendered language is concerned, the chief strategies appear to be widespread adoption of inclusive language for human beings and careful choice of inclusive language psalters. Traditional texts like the Lord's Prayer and the Creeds retain the gendered language of Father and Son. But Father is increasingly avoided elsewhere by using a different form of address to God, or altering the grammatical structure, or addressing prayers to Christ or the Holy Spirit. Adjectives for God denoting power and hierarchy, categories with traditionally masculine associations, are being replaced with language that emphasizes mercy, gentleness, and God's role as creator. It is not yet clear, though, that the new expansiveness has expanded far beyond more images of the maternal aspect of God. This somewhat measured advance may be attributed to several factors. Prominent among them, the inherently conservative approach of bodies responsible for authorizing and disseminating liturgical material for public worship. Anglicans, for the most part, are attached to their prayer book heritage, even though they may not know much about it. Also, the idea of the unity of member churches of the Anglican Communion and of the Communion itself is heavily invested in a belief in the broad uniformity of worship. Moving too far from that ideal, despite much evidence to show that things are not really like this in practice, presents a threat to what has most obviously held Anglicans together. A second factor is borrowing among member churches. Forms of prayer and the design of rites, as well as new rites, become known through gatherings of liturgists and through communications between national liturgical commissions. Ecumenical borrowing too is on the increase. Unofficial collections have exerted influence, probably because of the energy and freshness of their language and their freedom from the constraints placed upon much authorized composition. Janet Morley's All Desires Known, first published in 1988 and now in a third edition, and Stephen Shakespeare's Prayers for an Inclusive Church, published in 2008, have modelled a new and dynamic way of writing collects, and some of their prayers have found their way unchanged into published national prayer books, notably in Canada and in New Zealand. Some churches have produced their own alternative collects, but the distinction between alternative and principal will continue to shape the way worshippers think about their liturgical texts. There's always a preference for the principal variety. As a codicil to that, the way texts are encountered in printed weekly worship sheets, printed orders for special services, and words projected onto a screen means that fewer and fewer people have the experience of handling and exploring a real prayer book. This may turn out to be as much the loss of a future-orientated sense of the power and beauty of language to potential new composers of prayers as the loss of connection with tradition. So, what will future liturgical writers have to consider? The starting point is God. Angelus Hausling, writing in 1979 as his own Roman Catholic tradition began to reckon seriously with the outworking of the Second Vatican Council, called the study of liturgy to exercise its critical function. A major part of this task, he believed, was to find a way to talk about God as who God was for modern people, to address the problem of atheism, in other words, to recognize who or where he or it is who is so typically named God, and how people today can speak to and about him. Feminist theologians and philosophers of religion have led the way here, as Jenny Daggers sums up. On the one hand is a tendency to reconstruct church and theology anew, given critique of the heteropatriarchal and colonial nature of the received tradition. This is represented by theologians such as Lisa Isherwood, who advocates removing the otherness of the divine and seeking the incarnation in the relationships among human beings. On the other hand, there is a tendency represented, for example, by Janet Martin-Soskis, Tina Beattie, Sarah Coakley, and perhaps Catherine Tanner, which insists on an even-handed desire to do justice to the received tradition, while insisting that in the light of feminist critique, the tradition of church and theology from this time forward does gender justice. For those who are not yet ready to give up the otherness of God, Janet Martin-Soskis' work is indispensable. Her writing on metaphor, beginning with metaphor in religious language in 1985, and continuing in explorations of metaphorical language for the divine, in essays collected in The Kindness of God, and in a recent article called Naming God, or Why Names Are Not Attributes, she does much to probe and refine casual use of the idea of metaphors for God. These insights stand out for me. First, the metaphysical side of the inquiry should not be sacrificed to an empirical experiential approach, though of course the empirical has a valuable place in discussion. God is ultimately beyond language and our capacity for linguistic creativity. The apophatic is always present within the cataphatic. Secondly, we need to reckon seriously with metaphors for God as metaphors, figures of speech which derive their significance from their relationship to other terms. Of these, father remains the most complex, and Soskis argues that it is not analogically related to human fatherhood, but rather a relational term linked to the Son, Jesus. God can only be Father because Jesus is Son. Thirdly, we must pay attention to the distinction between the names human beings attribute to God and the names by which God reveals God's self. Soskis insists on the differences between names and attributes. Although I find this approach persuasive, I do not wish to discount the vital arena of liturgical practice. What worshippers hear and see when they gather for public prayer powerfully shapes both their sense of welcome and acceptance in a community and their understanding of God, especially God in relation to themselves. No amount of carefully nuanced theological explanation will make it easier for the child of an abusive parent to hear or say father, even wrapped in an artful paradox like the Brazilian maternal father. No instruction on the working of metaphor will displace the picture of a male God from Lord, Almighty God, King, God of power and might, or even possibly Creator. The act of worship, as liturgical theologians from Aidan Kavanagh in 1981 to Joris Geldhoff in 2020 have insisted, is Theologia Prima, the place where theological concepts are first realized even by those who have no formal theological language or training. Only later is this first experience shaped and instructed by Theologia Secunda, or academic theology. How in practice future Anglican revisers will respond to this challenge is a daunting and exciting prospect. Their brief will include maintaining something of that elusive thing called Anglican identity. They will be urged not to sacrifice the aesthetic qualities for which much Anglican liturgy has been admired. They will be instructed to be sensitive to issues of justice and inclusion. The advice of writers who have successfully produced prayers for public worship in an ungendered idiom will certainly inform the task. Composition with that objective will sharpen doctrinal questions, and so conversations with doctrine commissions and theologians in the academy become a necessary part of the work. At the other end of the spectrum, the experience of people who have struggled to find themselves represented and included is increasingly part of the evidence that leads to revision. Proper consultation can be the first step towards valuing those who more usually find themselves being talked about as problem categories, rather than treated as equals in dialogue, with something to teach. As if this were not a sufficiently demanding agenda, revisers are charged above all things with providing the means for worshippers to enter into the mystery of salvation. Might that objective, and also our current dearth of mystery, become the subject matter for the first stage of exploration? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Nichols, and there'll be an opportunity in a while to unpack some of those fascinating thoughts from your talk. But before we do that, could I move on to our second speaker, Dr. Thomassen, and please, Dr. Thomassen, ask you to speak now.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be asked to contribute to this conference. I am very much inspired by the Episcopal churches and the Episcopal liturgies, and I would love to share some experiences from Church of Norway and also from my own analytical findings in my doctoral thesis from 2007 on gender inclusive language in Church of Norway. I would like to make clear 3 points in my lecture. And the first one is a question of what's the use of gender inclusive language? I think many people asked us that question. Does it matter whether God is he, she, or it? For many churchgoers, the traditional male images of God are unproblematic. Our images of God are personal. For many of us, they have been an integrated part of our spirituality and faith since we were children, and they feel crucial for our faith. When I have been around in Norwegian parishes and taught the principles of gender inclusive language, quite many people have become provoked. The theme rocks some people's familiarity with their own image of God. Why should they let their personal images of God be disturbed or even destroyed, as one woman said to me, by this feminist theological idea? What's the problem with God our Father? You could ask, is there any need for gender inclusive language among Christian people? Is gender inclusive language a special interest for high-flying academic feminist scholars? I have 2 answers to these questions. Images of God are plural. The Bible does not use a image for God, but a lot of images. The reason for that is that God is far more than human language. God is not identical to the metaphors and images used in God talk, as the Americans says. The Bible is full of images and metaphors, but Christians are used to only some few of them: Father, Lord, Shepherd, and King. The gender inclusive language is trying to extend the use of metaphors by seeking the richness of the biblical metaphors. By using several metaphors, we become aware that the language of God never fully can cover the nature of God. In our limited human existence, we can only try to grasp a little bit of God through language. By using a variety of metaphors, we can grasp a little more than we are used to, but God is always more. Deus semper major. The American feminist theologian Sally McFade writes in her well-known monograph from 1983, Metaphorical Theology, that if we are not aware of the metaphorical nature of theological language, we risk 2 mistakes in our religious speech: idolatry and irrelevance. With idolatry, she says, it means that we worship the metaphor, not the reality behind the metaphor. We worship the metaphor Lord and the metaphor Father, not the ungraspable reality behind these metaphors. She also says that God talk becomes irrelevant because of the lack of understanding of religious language as a metaphorical language. McFade argues that in earlier times, people lived in a metaphorical universe. It was more obvious for most that metaphors was metaphors, not a literal description of an objective reality. By that mean, it was also more common to develop new metaphors, a larger freedom to make the theological speech relevant. In modernity, she says, we lost the metaphorical universe and was more literal in our speech in general. By losing of sight the metaphorical nature of theological speech, we risk that it lose its relevance. The absolutist king as a common metaphor for God is irrelevant for people today, even though it is common in liturgical use. The risk of idolatry and irrelevance is the first answer to the question of the use, what the use of gender-inclusive language is. The other answer has to do with the understanding of power. If God is male, then the male is God. Mary Daly wrote in Sexism and God Talk from 1973, one of the feminist theological classics. The metaphors we choose in our God Talk are never random. We pick and choose, and we deify what we think are most valuable in our own time and society. The Bible is full of examples. The Bedouin chief, the king, and the Lord, and even the Roman emperor is deified through the choice of metaphors. In church history, the absolutist king, etc., is deified. God is always described through metaphors, which reflects what we consider as most admirable. An analysis of the metaphors and images from our own time might reflect that we consider the coach or the therapist as the most admirable, but that might be another discussion or a later discussion. But I noticed that Bridget mentioned the Tongvan language, which has chosen to use to describe the Trinity like the royal family, and that's exactly an example of that we deify the most admirable in our own society. In any case, through the Jewish Christian tradition, men and patriarchy has been constantly deified by using male and patriarchal metaphors in 99% of the cases in theological language. Hildegard von Bingen, Mechtil of Magdeburg, and Julian of Norwich are rare and significant exceptions. But even if they were influential in their own times, their influence has got lost in our own time. Modern feminist theology seeks to destabilize the asymmetric male use of images for God. Even if it doesn't feel adequate for many of the parish members or even the clergy, the case doesn't lack its importance by that reason. This leads me to my next point, which is about heteronormativity, gender dichotomies, and binary oppositions. What happens when women and female images of God come to use in theological speech? Making women visible, as Bridget referred to, was a feminist theological slogan a couple of decades ago. The project was to use feminine metaphors for God and to mention women in the liturgical and theological texts. In Church of Norway, the ecumenical decade, Churches in Solidarity with Women, was a point of departure for official gender-inclusive liturgies. One of the prayers in the liturgies was introduced with God our Mother and Father, and the blessing was said in the name of the Creator, Redeemer, and Sustainer. The congregation was addressed as sisters and brothers, and God's daughters and sons. The reaction from the more conservative parts of the church was fierce. The liturgies were accused for being heretic and a break with the biblical and theological tradition. They were accused for being an attack on church from outside by secular feminist threats. In my doctoral thesis on this subject, I analyzed both the liturgies and also the debate on the liturgies. And even more interesting than the conservative reactions was the arguments from feminist theologians themselves. God's feminine nature was described as something different from God's masculine nature. The mother God was supposed to be more caring and near, more emotional, and more embodied than the father God. Some of the same heteronormative arguments were used to argue for women's need for gender-inclusive language. Women were supposed to be more down to earth, more concrete, more nurturing, and more concerned of birth giving and child raising. It was claimed that women needed a more poetic and reflective language in opposition to men who were supposed to prefer a more dogmatic and more precise and analytical language. No surprise that conservative theologians argue for heteronormativity and binary oppositions. It is far more surprising to notice that some feminist theologians argue, or argued at least, the same way. The conclusion in my thesis was that gender-inclusive language risked to confirm patriarchal language if it didn't become aware of avoiding heteronormativity and binary oppositions. The conclusion so far is that some gender-inclusive liturgies tends to be dichotomic and using binary oppositions. Not all, but quite many. Considering Sally McFake's point of deifying whatever we consider as most admirable, in some gender-inclusive liturgies, the nuclear family becomes deified by mother, father, brother, sister, and son, daughter images and metaphors and models. According to the reasoning of Mary Daly, if God is mother, then mothers are God. What about women who aren't mothers? What about women who are mothers? Is motherhood all that is to say about women who have given birth? In my thesis, I asked for further discussions which reflected our new knowledge on gender. Women are more than mothers, men are more than fathers, we are more than our reproductive abilities, and human beings are living in more diverse relationships than the post-Second War nuclear family constructions. My third and last point is on gender-inclusive language as a critical and constructive project. Does gender matter? Since I defended my thesis in 2007, the gender discourse has been aware of gender as fluid categories. It makes it easier to avoid binary oppositions, but at the same time, it also makes it more difficult to claim the need for women's visibility. If gender is a social construction, why argue for making one specific gender visible? Church of Norway initiated a liturgical reform in 2003. Gender-inclusive language was one of several objectives for the reform. In 2011, the Sunday service order was introduced in Church of Norway, and it was further revised in 2020. Regarding gender-inclusive language, the metaphors became quite pale and genderless. Several of the traditional masculine metaphors were downscaled. Father, king, and lord were not absent, but far less than earlier. But at the same time, the reform didn't dare to use specific feminine metaphors. To sum up, the images and metaphors are mostly ungendered. In my opinion, the Norwegian liturgical reform did not succeed in developing a gender-inclusive language. It turned out to be neither patriarchal nor gender-inclusive, but something in between, reflecting an uncertainty on how this should proceed. I think the situation in Norway reflects a contemporary theological crisis regarding liturgy and feminist theology and gender discussions. Feminist theology and gender-inclusive language is, according to the Swedish theologian Anne-Louise Eriksson, partly a critical project and partly a constructive project. As a critical project, gender-inclusive language succeeds in making church and theology aware of its patriarchal heritage. By insisting on women as full-fledged participants in church and theology, and insisting on non-patriarchal God talk, feminist theology functions as an eye-opener for the theological gender asymmetry. Its most important contribution to theological speech is, in my opinion, the insights of metaphorical theology. God is not a man, neither is she a woman. But all human beings are created in the image of God, which means that we all in some way or another have some similarities with God. That's why it is relevant to reflect God's diverse gender. As a constructive project, gender-inclusive language needs to deal with gender analysis to avoid confirming patriarchal language, but also with the nature of metaphorical theology. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Merete. Thank you, and thank both of you. I wonder if I could open up a short period of discussion to explore some of those fascinating and overlapping insights in your two papers. And perhaps I could begin with you, Merete, and ask you perhaps to say a little bit more concerning the difficult relationship that the Church of Norway has found between feminism in its various forms and the question of gendered language in liturgy. So simply to ask the question, can this relationship be creative or is it ultimately irrelevant?
I think it could be created, but the Church of Norway is more low church than the Scottish Episcopal Church. The laity movements are strong here, and the suspicion against feminism is very strong. And the argument that feminism is something which threatens church from outside as an expression for secular forces is very widespread in the arguments. But we also have, of course, Norway is one of the most equal, gender equal societies in the world. So acceptance for gender equality is also strong here. But I think that Church of Norway is open for feminist theology, but when it comes to naming God, the reactions are fierce and strong. The skepticism is very strong.
That does seem to me to pose a real difficulty between the cultural context in Norway and the concerns of the church, which seem to me to be very disparate on this particular issue. Bridget, I wonder if you have any comments that you would like to add to that.
Yes, I mean, I suppose certainly in the Church of England and the Church of Ireland, where my most recent experience has been, things have possibly even worked the other way, in the sense that secular society has lost interest in the church as having any kind of progressive potential and just gone its own way because it washes its hands of the endemic conservatism. And yet, I mean, I don't give up hope entirely. And I know that since the three of us have been having conversations towards today, I noticed that I have been much more attentive to the kinds of words I'm using when I'm involved in some act of worship. And Merete, you used a very interesting choice of vocabulary when you talked about the shocked reactions in the parishes, and that people were they wished their language to be neither disturbed nor destroyed. But
yes,
I think if it disturbs us, it's not doing too badly. It doesn't mean you have to discard it, but it does mean that we're not using it unthinkingly, which seems to have enormous creative potential.
it does. It's very interesting because a couple of years I worked at a Church of Norway Center against sexual abuse and violence, and when I had that hat on me, I could say that, oh, it's so important to have other metaphors than the father metaphor, because people who are exposed are abused, they need other metaphors. And then everybody just nodded their head and said, yes, it's very important. But when I argued from a specific feminist point of view, then the reactions was very critical. So, but my arguments was exactly the same. I think the sexual abuse argument is much stronger. I think it's much easier. Yes. Sorry.
I wonder whether perhaps both of you, as teachers in higher education, have any thoughts about taking your final thought there, Merete, onto the way in which over the last few decades, such things as feminism have trained us as university and college teachers to be very sensitive to the kind of language we use in our lectures and teaching. And yet it's precisely, as it were, arguing against that kind of inclusive or gender self-conscious language that you seem to be suggesting the churches are in some way falling short. What do you feel, Bridget, that there's a sort of discontinuity between our language on the one hand as teachers and our language as people concerned with liturgy?
I think that's absolutely true, and perhaps it's partly a kind of self-protective anxiety about the kinds of authorities that might catch up with us if we were less careful about our language. But certainly, I know that in the classroom, I do think very carefully and try to be self-conscious about using inclusive pronouns as far as possible. But also, I suppose the ways in which you teaching people who are preparing for ordination, which is what you're doing as well, Merete. That's right. I mean, sometimes being careful that you also have to reckon with a certain measure of student conservatism in certain areas. And when you're about to trample over their precious moments, that has to be done with a certain kind of a tactical care as well. But I suppose that sort of leads us back into the way that the church uses language in its own worship. And perhaps we are too ready to take refuge in what we've always done and what the majority of, particularly in churches which notice that they're becoming more elderly, feel, well, this generation is comfortable with that kind of language, and maybe young people would go somewhere where they found something that was more congenial.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I think we lose the richness, the fullness of the metaphors when we are just holding to the traditional. So it works sometimes as an eye-opener for surprisingly many people, I think, to see that if you you don't have to think of God as that figure in heaven, in the Sistine Chapel, the Creator God in the Sistine Chapel. God is both and not that.
We'll come on to the question of metaphor in a little while, but I'd like to ask a second question, particularly directed in the first instance towards you, Bridget. And you mentioned Stephen Shakespeare's book of collects entitled Prayers for an Inclusive Church. And I'd like to ask you what you think such inclusion might mean, and how would a truly inclusive church approach the problem of gender inclusive language? And perhaps has the Church of New Zealand been most successful in dealing with this problem?
Well, it seems to me that Stephen Shakespeare is using inclusion here in a sense that is wider than many people immediately assume when you use the word, because what they usually mean is they assume that you're talking about sexual orientation under a kind of cover word. But I think what he's doing is trying to discover a liturgical language that doesn't alienate, but at the same time, you could think that the lowest common denominator would be to produce something that is extraordinarily bland and uninteresting. But his great success is in finding a register that is largely gender-free, and yet seems to produce an enormous kind of vitality in the writing. And yet he also does this without producing things that are bizarre. And I think he's found a way to somehow to recraft or to reimagine the language in which we imagine, in which we wonder what God is doing in our lives, and to, in a sense, to play with ideas of divine presence in the human sphere. But divine presence as something that is not static, and not perhaps therefore less capable of becoming the object of idolatry. But yes.
I think that word vitality in language is an extremely important one, which perhaps isn't sufficiently used in liturgical discussion, or at least sufficiently explored. Merete, what do you feel about this question of the use of inclusion and how that relates to more traditional, if I can put it that way, notions of gender inclusion?
Well, I think the meaning has changed in the 80s and 90s, and maybe even in the beginning of the 2000s. Then inclusion was women, and now it is same-sex marriage and the LGBTQI+ categories, which is a burning issue. But also ethnicity and all the things you refer to, Bridget. Inclusiveness is much wider than making women visible. So yeah.
So it does include that as well, of course. It's wider, but it includes that. I mean, can you put your finger, Bridget, on why you think the Church of New Zealand has been so successful in its liturgical experiments in a multicultural situation?
It's been brave, I think. It hasn't tried to hang on to vestiges of Book of Common Prayer language, but it's found its own kind of dignified register, which is not. I wouldn't describe it as unusually linguistically adventurous in the sense that it's providing very unusual new shapes for prayers, or using a kind of register and vocabulary that is vastly unecclesiastical and unfamiliar. But in some ways it's almost done the opposite of that, which is to use language which is really quite ordinary and sometimes quite domestic, and yet it's managed to elevate this to a kind of solemnity. Wouldn't be the right word. I think it's a kind of ordinary dignity which it's achieved, and it's so unostentatious that it's not intruding itself on your consciousness at all. And it seems to me that it's managing in a very modestly poetic way to get on with the job, which sounds in a way like damning with faint praise, but in fact I think that's an extraordinary achievement.
Thank you. That brings me nicely on to the next point that I'd really like to first ask you about, Merete. And you talked about perhaps the decline of metaphorical language in modern language, which is much more literal and so on. But there you've got an example in the New Zealand liturgy of ordinary language, which nevertheless is liturgically still very powerful. So to go back for a moment to Stephen Shakespeare's Book of Prayers, he says there that prayer is fundamentally about openness to and growth in relationships. So I'd like just to ask you how you think a better understanding of the nature of metaphor promotes this claim and helps us to overcome the difficulties of gender exclusion in our liturgical prayers.
I would say that prayer is doxology, not because doxology holds us into the faith that God is caring for us and is caring for humankind. So, but of course, prayer has to do with our relations, and the metaphors are making us aware how we are interrelated to God and one another. And the traditional metaphors, they are so oftenly used that we have lost of sight that they are metaphors, that God is not a king, but God could be compared to a king, similarities to a king, but is always more. And of course, king could work as a metaphor because the king wants his inhabitants to live together peacefully and productive and happy. But of course, I think we all search for the new name of God for our age, because we are threatened by so many things, and just now, right in the pandemic and the climate crisis and everything. Who is God now? Which metaphors can we use? Who may? Yeah.
I remember many years ago, George Steiner used the phrase "the long life of metaphor," which seemed to indicate that metaphors, of course, do die eventually. They do become sterile and objective, if you like. So that takes me back to this question of vitality, and that is how do we discover vital new metaphors? Metaphors always being insufficient. That's one of the qualities of the metaphorical, that it's always, as it were, stretching out to that which is always more than itself. So do you have any comments on that, Bridget? How we, as it were, rediscover lively metaphors and have the courage, perhaps, to abandon metaphors whose lives have come to an end?
Some of those metaphors, I think they will emerge in surprising places, sometimes in the biblical text, which it's often seemed to me that some of the most vital and the strongest prayers recently written have started with a very kind of arresting biblical image. But I think that there are also ways of reanimating metaphors that might have become, if not actually tired, then a bit conventional and used as if by rote. And I think that the Epiphany Prayer, which I mentioned a bit earlier, is not a bad example of that. It addresses Jesus as light of the world, which so far is fairly conventional, but it then projects the story into the narrative of the visit of the Magi and the star resting over the place, which becomes it leads the congregation into the possibility of considering what wisdom and rulership mean in the present age. And that seems to me to be doing something creative and new with a metaphor which might otherwise merely be attractive.
And it's quite unobtrusive as well, isn't it? It's new, but actually it takes a while for that kind of vitality to filter through. We're almost at the end of our time together, but I wonder, before we conclude, whether I could ask, first of all, you, Merete, if you have any final comments that you'd like to make, or to say things that perhaps my questions have not allowed you to articulate.
Oh, I would like to say, be playful when you search for images and metaphors. I think that's a very important way to search for a new language. Don't be afraid. Do not fear. That's my final word.
Thank you very much. And Bridget, how about you?
I think that I would like to encourage people always to be prepared to go deeper and just to ask themselves why they're using a particular word. I think many things are legitimate if you know why you're doing them, And that it seems to me that which is not, of course, moving very far away from the metaphorical sphere we've been talking about, but we have a rare and rich gift in language, but I think using it discerningly might be one very powerful instrument in the whole discussion about revision.
Thank you very much indeed.
Mm.
Thank you both, Dr. Nichols and Dr. Thomassen, for your speeches and your contributions to the conversation. I think it's opened up a whole area of ideas that perhaps need to be carefully considered, particularly when we're concerned with liturgical revision and writing liturgical prayers. So we're very grateful to you and hope that this discussion may continue in other parts of the conference. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Merete.
Thank you, Bridget and David.